Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is one of my favorite parts of these weekly presentations because it gives us a chance to dig a little deeper, connect the dots, and really challenge ourselves to think critically about what we've been discussing. In this bonus episode, I'm going to explore the contradictions in the gospel accounts of Jesus' infancy, the Infancy Narratives, as they're called, particularly the presentation at the temple. I'm going to spend some time examining the historical and literary reasons for these inconsistencies. We'll approach this with a secular, mythological perspective, recognizing that while these stories are sacred to many people, they are also works of literature that have been clearly shaped by human hands, cultural contexts, and theological motives. Our discussion in the main episode was about the readings for the Feast of the Presentation of the Lord, and we pulled out some universal humanist messages, things like refining ourselves, recognizing the potential in others, and making the most of the time we have. But I think it's important to take a little detour. Now, you may not have noticed, but there was something strange in the main episode's gospel reading. Something that doesn't quite line up with another famous story from the Gospels. The author of Luke has Mary and Joseph peacefully presenting baby Jesus at the temple, a beautiful and public religious moment. But wait a second, wasn't the Holy Family supposed to be running for their lives to Egypt to escape Herod's massacre of infants? That's what the author of Matthew tells us. But Luke gives us a completely different sequence of events. And here's the thing, the two versions can't both be true. This isn't just a minor detail. It's a pretty big contradiction, and it forces us to ask an important question. If these accounts don't align, what does that tell us about how and why they were written? And to be clear, we're not talking about two different versions of something that was said or two perspectives of the same event. We're talking about two completely separate and incompatible series of events. It's not like, well, one eyewitness to the accident said the car was blue and the other said it was red. Or even like, one said it was a car and the other said it was an SUV. It's more like, one witness said it was a blue car in New York City, and the other eyewitness said it was a hiker in the Rockies wearing Crocs. So here's the deal. These infancy narratives, they weren't written as journalistic reports or eyewitness testimony. They were theological constructs shaped by human hands, designed to communicate specific messages to different audiences. So in this Afterthoughts segment, we're going to take a closer look at these discrepancies, explore the theological motivations behind Matthew and Luke's versions of Jesus' early years, and see what these contradictions reveal about the way religious narratives evolve. So let's dig into this contradiction, because it's a big one. In Luke's gospel, we get this peaceful, reverent scene. Mary and Joseph, following Jewish law, they bring baby Jesus to the temple in Jerusalem. There they encounter Simeon, who declares Jesus as the light for all people. Now, if we had read a little further, we would also have seen Anna, a prophetess, who also speaks about the child's significance. Afterward, they simply return home to Nazareth. No danger, no threats. Just a quiet, traditional religious rite and a smooth transition back to family life. Now compare that to Matthew's gospel, where things look very different. Instead of a quiet presentation at the temple, Matthew tells us that after Jesus is born, King Herod, alarmed by the Magi's visit, orders the massacre of all infant boys in Bethlehem. This forces the Holy Family to flee in the dead of night, escaping to Egypt and living there as refugees until Herod finally dies. Only then do they make their way back, choosing to settle in Nazareth to avoid further trouble. So here's the glaring problem. Both of these stories can't be true. If the family was on the run from a murderous king, how did they casually stroll into the temple, the most prominent religious site in Jerusalem, Herod's backyard, basically, and present their child in a very public religious ceremony? If Herod was truly hunting down all infant boys in Bethlehem, wouldn't that have been the perfect place to find him? And if Jesus had already been publicly recognized as someone special, wouldn't word have gotten back to Herod pretty quickly? This is one of those moments where we have to acknowledge that these are not historical accounts. They're symbolic stories, and they're shaped by different theological motives, and they're aimed at different audiences. Matthew's version aligns Jesus with Moses, escaping a cruel ruler's slaughter of infants and later returning from Egypt, just as Moses did. Luke's version, on the other hand, paints a more orderly, law-abiding picture of Jesus' early life, which appealed to Gentile audiences that valued civic stability. But neither of these narratives were meant to be read as strict history. They are mythological constructs. They're crafted stories designed to reinforce the identity and the significance of Jesus in different ways. But recognizing that doesn't diminish their literary or cultural value. Of course, it does force us to read them for what they are, not for what some might claim them to be. So if these two gospel accounts can't be reconciled, the next logical question is, why did Matthew and Luke make up such different stories in the first place? The short answer? Different audiences and different agendas. So let's start with Matthew. He was writing for a Jewish Christian audience, people who already knew and valued the Hebrew Scriptures, but they needed convincing that Jesus was the fulfillment of their messianic expectations. That's why Matthew structures his infancy narratives to make Jesus look like the new Moses. Herod, playing the role of Pharaoh, slaughters the innocent infants. The Holy Family's flight into Egypt, it mirrors Moses' own escape from death as a baby. And when they finally return from Egypt, it parallels the Exodus, God's people returning to the Promised Land. None of that is accidental, and none of it is true. Matthew is using a well-known Jewish storytelling technique called midrash. Essentially, it's the retelling and reinterpreting of old stories to explain new events. And this explains why Matthew includes these dramatic elements like the massacre of the innocents. It's a horrifying event for which we have no historical evidence outside of this gospel story. I'm sorry, but if a widespread slaughter of babies like that had really happened, there would have been at least one Roman or Jewish historian who would have mentioned it. And there were plenty of Roman and Jewish historians who actually did document the historical events during that time. But there's nothing. The most logical explanation is that the author of Matthew wasn't documenting history. He was crafting a theological narrative that made sense to his Jewish readers. He used well-known historical characters to give a little bit of credibility to the story, which also, incidentally, forced people to change the year that Jesus was allegedly born. You see, Herod the Great died in 4 BCE, which is a historical fact. So, in order for the events in Matthew's infancy narratives to take place, Jesus wasn't born in the year 1. He must have been born around 6 BCE. Now, let's look at Luke, which was our gospel reading for this episode. His audience wasn't primarily Jewish. He was writing for a Gentile Christian audience, people who had just very little familiarity with Hebrew prophecy, but who wanted assurance that following Jesus was a legitimate path. That's why Luke paints a very different picture of Jesus' early life. Instead of a family on the run from a tyrant, the author of Luke's gospel presents Jesus as a universal savior, peacefully recognized at the temple, the center of Jewish religious life. And unlike Matthew, Luke doesn't have the midnight flight to Egypt. There's no infant massacre, no secrecy. It's just an open, public declaration that Jesus is someone special. And this isn't a minor detail. It fits into Luke's broader theological vision. The temple plays a huge role in the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts, which most scholars and historians believe was probably written by the same anonymous author. His Jesus isn't the new Moses. He's simply the fulfillment of Israel's faith, but in a way that welcomes all people, Jew and Gentile alike. This was important for early Christianity's expansion beyond its Jewish roots. There was a method to what he was doing. So what does all of this tell us? Well, these aren't historical biographies. They're theological stories, and they were shaped to meet the needs of different audiences. Once we recognize that, we can stop trying to force them to fit together and instead read them for what they are. Mythological narratives designed to communicate specific messages, not to communicate verifiable history. So, what do Christian scholars and theologians do with the fact that Matthew and Luke's infancy narratives completely contradict each other? Well, it depends on who you ask. Some apologists, the folks whose, job it is to defend the Bible's accuracy, they try to harmonize the two accounts. They claim that both stories could have happened, just at different times. So in this view, the Holy Family apparently first presented Jesus at the temple, as Luke says, but then they went back home to Nazareth, which is also what Luke says. And then sometime later, the Magi showed up, as Matthew describes, which led to Herod's massacre and the flight into Egypt. The problem is that this doesn't hold up under any sort of scrutiny. Matthew's story strongly suggests that the family spent years in Egypt, only returning after Herod's death. He even has them avoiding Judea and settling in Galilee as if they've never lived there before. Luke, on the other hand, makes it sound like the Holy Family simply followed the usual Jewish customs, visited the temple in Jerusalem after Jesus' birth, and then immediately went back to Nazareth. No mention of Egypt, no mention of Herod's massacre. If both accounts were somehow true, then Joseph and Mary took Jesus to the temple right under Herod's nose, and then just went back home, hanging around in Judea until the Magi tipped Herod off. It just doesn't make sense. These aren't two different parts of the same story. They are two completely separate versions of a story. And that brings us to mainstream biblical scholarship. Unlike apologists, most biblical scholars, whether they're Christian or not, acknowledge that Matthew and Luke are writing theologically motivated narratives, not verifiable history. The differences aren't a problem if you stop expecting them to be historically accurate in the first place. But this raises an even bigger issue. If the Gospels can contradict each other on something as major as Jesus' infancy, what does that say about their overall reliability? If they aren't trustworthy as historical accounts, then perhaps they should be read for what they truly are: mythological storytelling shaped for specific theological purposes. And once we recognize that, we're free to analyze and interpret them without forcing them to be something they're not. But at the end of the day, whether Matthew and Luke's infancy stories are historically accurate isn't really the point. These stories have shaped Western culture, art, literature, and religious traditions for centuries. Their influence is undeniable. But that influence doesn't come from them being factually true. It comes from their power as myth. And that's the real takeaway here. Myths don't need to be historical to be meaningful. Every culture throughout history has created narratives to explain its values, its struggles, its hopes. That's exactly what the authors of Matthew and Luke were doing. They weren't journalists. They weren't biographers. They were storytellers, shaping the Jesus narrative in ways that would resonate with their intended audiences. So instead of asking, did this really happen? We should ask, why did they write it this way? What were they trying to communicate? What fears, hopes, or cultural tensions were they addressing? When we ask those questions, we can move past blind acceptance, and we can engage with these stories in a way that's honest, curious, and frankly, far more interesting. The truth is, religious traditions evolve over time, and the stories they tell evolve with them. If we can acknowledge the literary and theological origins of these stories, we don't have to force them to be something they're not. We can see them for what they truly are. Mythological narratives crafted for specific purposes. They're not historical records, but they're certainly cultural artifacts, and they reveal something about the people who wrote them. And maybe, just maybe, that's where their real value lies. So now that we've explored the contradictions in the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, let's step back and think about, well, what this all means. If these two Gospels tell completely different versions of Jesus' birth, how does that change the way we approach these stories? Should people still think of them as divinely inspired history, or does this reveal them as more human stories that are simply shaped by culture, theology, and literary tradition? And if we see this much variation in just two accounts of the same event, two stories that are supposed to be about the most important birth in human history, what does that mean for the rest of the biblical narrative? If these writers were comfortable inventing details or altering events to fit their audience's expectations, how much of the rest of the Gospels might be shaped by the same process? For some, these stories still carry deep meaning, and that's okay. Myths can be meaningful, even when we know they aren't historical. But for those of us committed to critical thinking, to honesty and intellectual curiosity, recognizing these contradictions frees us to engage with these writings in a completely different way, not as records of divine events, but as cultural artifacts that tell us more about the people who wrote them than about the events they claim to describe. And that's why it's so important to keep questioning, to keep exploring, and to keep thinking critically. Whether it's the Bible, history, politics, or even our own deeply held beliefs, there is power in being willing to challenge assumptions and follow the evidence wherever it leads. So, as I wrap up this bonus episode of the MTB podcast, I'll leave you with this one thought. What other stories, ideas, or beliefs have you accepted without question? And what might happen if you started to explore them with the same curiosity and honesty that I've tried to apply here? Well, thanks for joining me for these Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to thecodaproject.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll also keep you updated on these weekly live streams of Mythologizing the Bible and any other live streaming that I end up doing. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth.